and facing the darkness, experiencing its heaviness, and we were together in it, and God was felt. I listened to slow breathing through the phone and felt grateful. Holding our phones to our ears, we were practically in each other's heads, as though my directee were pressed against me. I closed my eyes and rested in the rich, lively silence of exquisite darkness. During that particular hour, the Spirit was tending to me as well as to the directee. My own story was that only hours before this conversation, a friend had called me in the darkness before dawn so I could be with her as she was with her dying father, also a beloved friend of mine. Because death was near, she'd been allowed into the COVID quarantined care facility. Following a long illness, her father had just breathed his final breaths. As I held the phone to my ear, I heard his daughter's breathing and weeping. In the darkness with my friend, as during the time with the directee, I registered exquisiteness, which the directee so aptly named. It was as if the other person, each of them, escorted me into a personal darkness, stopped there, and as we strengthened one another by our closeness, our eyes acclimated to the darkness as eyes do on a moonless night. Slowly, we began to see the pinprick lights of the stars. We developed night vision, as it were, and felt God's grace descend on us in the starlight. The directee said that even in the dark there was light and presence. That presence made the darkness exquisite. My directee's words carried God's grace to the depths of my own heartache over my friend's death. The word exquisite means of consummate and delightful excellence, a fine description of the Holy One, I think. And it's what I feel myself floating in when directees open their souls to God in my presence, even when they do so in lament. To see more clearly in the dark, it's best to douse our bright manufactured lights so that we can see the faint, steady light of the heavens, the delightful, excellent, exquisite light. The pandemic has offered that opportunity. That experience counters the forces of the pandemic towards fear, stress, loneliness, and languishing. In our relationships with others and ourselves, we can choose to move away from false light, from our bright-siding stories and only half-believed affirmations which would deny the reality of suffering. And then, and only then, we just might acclimate to the darkness and begin to see the faint light, the light that penetrates the darkness and is not overcome. This experience of exquisite darkness can happen in solitude, but even more profoundly, it's experienced with the right kind of accompaniment. In her later years, my precious mother, now no longer with us, used to speak of solitary splendor. During her few times alone at home, she felt herself expanding into silence and thoroughly enjoying it. She spoke to God, sometimes aloud. From time to time, she and I would talk on the phone while she basked in solitary splendor. She said that talking with me about her joy deepened it. We savored it together. The companionship made each of our solitudes even more splendid. During the pandemic, my mother's experience has come to mind because in connecting with other people by phone or Zoom, we create a dyad or a community of solitaries as we are now. If we are trusting, vulnerable, and trustworthy, that experience can be full of grace. The historian Tom Rees has used a German word that has stayed with me since I read it. The word is Zweieinsamkeit and simply means dual solitude. But Rees defined it as grace-filled dual solitude, and I like that. My guess is that Rees was influenced by the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. In Letters to a Young Poet, Rilke wrote about a mature form of love, which consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and greet each other. The loving, guarding attention of another meets us in our solitude. The word border makes me imagine a sheltered place of dual solitude, and that's what I've experienced by phone and Zoom in this quarantine year. When my spiritual director or a friend listens to me in all my unsettled, vulnerable honesty, there is a grace that pervades my quarantined solitude. I can move beyond the irritations of feeling so vulnerable and sequestered. That loving, guarding attention must be what Jesus wanted from his companions as he suffered in Gethsemane. We trust it's what he received from the angel. It's what I hope to extend to others, even as we move out of sheltering in place. Presence can make even the deepest darkness exquisite. We who believe in the God who is love, and in whom we live and move and have our being, theologically affirm the pervasiveness of grace-filled dual solitude. Even in the bleakest circumstances, night vision is possible, and solitude can aid it. Henry Nouwen wrote of solitude as a place of tethering and reorientation, where we can connect with profound bonds that are deeper than the emergency bonds of fear and anger. We felt a lot of emergency bonds of fear and anger during the pandemic. And I think that even more, having a listening companion beside us in our solitude can help us discover our stories and feelings and give voice to them in that place of healing and reorientation, of untangling and tethering. The poet Robert Louis Stevenson described dual solitude this way: there's a fellowship more quiet even than solitude, and which rightly understood is solitude made perfect. As we tell our stories, or listen to and listen for God, we discover and we learn. Now in this pandemic year, we've learned many things about coronaviruses, contagion, vaccine development, herd immunity, variants, and the effects of quarantining and masking, about our social, professional, and even worship possibilities over electronic devices, about our own psyches and how they fare in enforced solitude and the ever-present threat of infection. But we have also, to varying degrees and consciousness, gained the knowledge which comes from seeking and sometimes encountering the Holy One. Perhaps in the company of a listening other, we may have discovered the treasures of darkness and the one who calls us by name. That knowledge, while hard to express, carries authority and has staying power. Something in us has been changed. We are being formed by God's grace. For some of us, even with hardships, healing has taken place. The other person, in a stance of love, elicited our story and now cherishes and remembers it. The knots untangle a bit. We breathe more deeply, take a step away from what Nouwen calls the emergency bonds of fear and anger, as we're heard, tethered, met. As we acclimate to the darkness, we may experience it as exquisite by virtue of holy presence. That was my experience with my directee who felt alone, depressed, and useless in quarantine. With that directee, I found that my own grief over my friend's death was whole and full, held in the steady starlight of God's exquisite grace, even as I listened to the person on the other end of the phone. Our stories, my directee's spoken and mine unspoken, mingled as we breathed together, noticing God with us. This is what I've witnessed during the pandemic. Have you experienced darkness this year? Have you been accompanied during the pandemic and accompanied others? Hold those stories. Tell them. Let them be clarified and untangled by God's grace. They are treasures we carry from the pandemic.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. I was looking online here at a definition of exquisite. It says marked by flawless craftsmanship or by beautiful, ingenious, delicate, or elaborate execution. And I think we experienced that from you tonight. Thank you. Are you open to a few questions?
Sure.
Okay. We have a question here. How do you see this gift of vulnerability being nurtured as our environments open again? And she says, I have a foreboding sense that it may be one of the things that returns to normal.
Excellent question, and one that I'm asking myself, one that the people I listen to are asking themselves. We need to find ways of noticing what the gifts of the pandemic have been so that we can shelter and treasure and preserve them and continue to receive them going forward. So I was just before this time started, I was out at the mailbox. My neighbor was at the mailbox. She's in her early 70s, a professor. And she said, you know, as this pandemic goes on, I'm aware I'm ready to retire. I just need more time by myself, more time to think, more time to write. So some people are making big decisions to hold on to those gifts from the pandemic, and others are making small ones.
Big decisions and small ones. Thank you. Another question came up early on. You talked about a lot of us wearing our slippers. The piece you can't see on Zoom. And I'm wondering, based on what you've said and how you've laid out so beautifully the darkness and the light and how they commingle together, what kind of footwear are we going to need as Christians to walk out of this darkness, at least this dark time that we're in? To use your analogy of footwear, I found that intriguing.
Wow, that is a very fun question. I think it needs to not be too heavy and have good traction. That's what comes to mind. But maybe some form of dancing shoe like that.
There's a song there. Yeah. Does anyone else have a question for Susan? This is your time. This is the moment for you. You can unmute yourself and speak it out.